Everybody. I wanted to visit with you and talk back through a little bit of week one and also discuss week two. So I read through your discussion board posts. I had hoped to comment more on your second question, but we had pretty severe storms here, and my internet was not letting me in to comment on your second discussion board. But you'll see me pretty often in there joining in your discussion. Anyway, I wanted to talk some about your questions from that discussion board that I wasn't able to answer. So one of the questions I saw was talking about the short story literary analysis paper, a word count. I don't have a particular word count. Typically, this paper ends up being around 2 pages. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea. Usually about 6 to 8 sentences per paragraph. I know on the literary analysis directions, and here I'll pull that up, it says 2 to 4 body paragraphs. Really more like 3 to 4 body paragraphs for that paper. Remember that it needs to be an MLA, so double space, Times New Roman, 12-point font, all of those things. You need a clear introduction with a thesis statement, 3 to 4 body paragraphs that have a topic sentence and a conclusion, as well as the works cited citation for your story. You are welcome to do stories from the book, just not stories we've done together. Okay, so you can't do A and P, you cannot do A Rose for Emily, you can't do any of the stories that we're reading in week 2 together. So just some things to keep in mind. You're welcome to pick any of the other stories in the book that we're not going to do together. Or if there's an author you really like, maybe find something else by them. So we're going to read a lot of different authors in week 2. If there's something you like from there, feel free to look for a different story, but you cannot use the story that we do together because we're already going to do some analysis together, so that really wouldn't be fair. Also keep in mind that your novel paper is exactly the same. So in week 1, I basically asked you to do a very, very short analysis of one of the short stories. So that very same kind of analysis is what you're then going to do as a whole paper over a short story. Okay, and so that's that first paper. And then you're going to do the same type of writing analysis, but you're going to do it over the novel. So make sure that you're choosing a novel, that you already started reading that novel, because many of you commented you noticed things the second time reading through that you didn't notice the first time. And that's true for any type of reading, but of course for a novel that's going to be more work. So make sure you have selected a novel. It needs to be from that list that I posted, which is in the assignments. So make sure you're also working on that on the side. I know it's a lot. I understand that, but this is an entire class in 8 weeks. So the great news is in 8 weeks you'll be done and you can do this. So here's the novel analysis or the novel list for your analysis papers right here. Just choose from one of those. Okay, so in week 2, a couple of things. Our goals for this week are to talk about character setting, tone, style, and irony. Okay, and so those are the key ideas. The outcome we're trying to hit on from the syllabus is describe the development and characteristics of a short story. Okay, so you have 2 preses to look at. You have quite a few stories to read. Because this is essentially 2 weeks of work into 1 week. All right, so that's just kind of how it's going to go. But you can do this. Some of these stories you may be familiar with already because you may have read them in high school, but you probably aren't doing the kind of in-depth analysis that we're doing. All right, so also don't forget, discussion board is due Thursday, your original response, and then replies are due by Sunday. Also, the quizzes on the stories are due by Sunday. If I would offer you one suggestion, it would be to hold off on the quizzes until later on in the week, because we're going to discuss the stories in the discussion board, and I will be in there teaching you during the week. So I would probably wait to take the quizzes on the stories until later on, towards the end of the week. Of course, you can take them anytime, so if that doesn't work with your schedule, that's fine. But we're going to be teaching the stories all week, so you might want to hold off on some of those quizzes, especially if you're not feeling really comfortable with a story. The stories from last week weren't too difficult. But if you're not completely sure about some of these stories, hold off on those quizzes until we've discussed them for a little while. One thing I did notice about your literary theory or your literary analysis of either A&P or Rose for Emily, remember that analysis needs to only have one idea in it. So if you're going to do a symbol, it needs to be one symbol. Okay, if you're going to do a particular theme, it needs to be one theme. So be very, very careful that you're only focusing on one idea when you're doing analysis. It needs to be very, very specific, very concrete. So just a word of advice that I noticed from the discussion board that I want to make sure you consider for your paper. Also, in the discussion board, make sure you're answering all the questions. If you lost points for this week, it probably was because you didn't answer every question that I posed. Rather than giving you 3 or 4 discussion boards or 3 or 4 threads, I try to put it just in one and have multiple questions because I find that the discussion goes much better than you trying to bounce back and forth between different threads. So you will each week have multiple questions to answer. When you're writing that original post, make sure you're answering all the questions because that immediately will be points that you will lose if you don't answer every question. So if you were missing points from this week, it's probably because you didn't answer the question, all of the questions. So that would be my piece of advice. Okay, so in week 2, we're going to talk about character, setting, tone, style, irony. You have great stories to read. These are some of my students' favorite stories every semester. So I hope you dig into these. We're going to kind of put analysis, over in the corner for now. We're going to talk about some of the other literary elements. Remember that in week 1, and I'll go back there. Remember in week 1, I posted your key terms for fiction. So you should have printed that out and make sure you're adding the terms from this week into that sheet, because then that's your study guide for the fiction test that will be at the end of this unit. So make sure you have that done. Because in week 2, we'll introduce more terms. I will be honest and say these are probably terms you know, but you may not have applied them to these stories, okay? But I want to talk a little bit about fiction, so let me pull this up here. All right, so fiction, of course, is imagined stories. This is the most popular type of writing that has lots of different genres inside of it: historical, realistic, science fiction, fantasy. Those are all genres inside of fiction, okay? So typically short stories, fiction, those are my students' favorites. There are lots of different types of fiction. Some of these, the one we're going to focus on is short story simply because that's what we have time for. But, of course, lots of other types. One I want to focus on is satire, when we use humor to make fun of something. Some of you may have read Animal Farm, and that is a great example of satire. Initiation story is when the main character undergoes some rite of passage. I saw somebody had mentioned in the discussion board To Kill a Mockingbird, and To Kill a Mockingbird would be an initiation story for Scout. So typically some of the characteristics, they have very few characters, a really simple setting. They're actually not that old. We haven't been doing short stories that long. Hawthorne really got us started in there. And Poe later really defined what a short story is because he said a short story is something that can be read from beginning to end in one sitting. All right, so that's kind of how he defined a short story. And since Poe's kind of the master, he gets to define it how he wants to. So the plot structure is very similar to any other kind of plot structure. One thing I will say, a lot of times in short stories, we start with the exposition, rising action, get to the climax, and then have very little falling action or conclusion. That's part of how it has its power. So keep that in mind when you're reading through these short stories, that you may not see the entire plot structure. There are also other kinds of plot terms that you can use. The one that I want to focus on, because we're going to talk about this one again in drama, is peripeteia, which is a sudden change of fortune. So when something is going really great and then it suddenly turns really bad, or when something is going terrible and then suddenly this great fortune happens, okay? And so that's maybe a new term for you. In medias res is also maybe another new plot term, which means we start in the middle. So rather than starting at the beginning of the story, we jump right into the middle of the story. Also, there are various points of view. Make sure you understand these, how they're a little bit different. And we will come back to these again when we talk about drama. So, that's not going away. Of course, character is important here. We have different kinds of characters. We have our protagonist versus our antagonist. There are different types of narrators. Of course, we have just the traditional narrator, but we also have the naive narrator, which some people say that's what Scout is in To Kill a Mockingbird. Also, we have the unreliable narrator. So, can we trust our narrator to tell us the truth? Is always a question. We have static versus dynamic characters. That is, static characters don't typically change, whereas dynamic characters do. We have flat versus round characters. So flat characters typically have one trait. They're very simple. They're usually supporting characters. Round characters have lots of characteristics. So we really see a big, the overall picture, which is why they're round characters. The anti-hero, we will actually talk about some. This is the disappointing hero. So the hero who's not really a hero. We have stock characters. These are those stereotypical characters like the sidekick. Foils are characters who are pairs. So we see two characters, and they tend to be they share something in common, but also have something exactly opposite about them. We will talk about that more when we get to Hamlet. Okay, and then character motivation. Why is it a character does what he or she does? So some things to keep in mind. Setting. Please remember, it's not just time, it's also place. So it's not just when, but also where. Weather is also part of the setting. And setting, one element of setting is the atmosphere. And so setting can contribute to the atmosphere or to the mood. If it's some really creepy setting, then that also contributes to the mood that the reader feels. Regionalism is when it's set in a particular region. We're going to do some Flannery O'Connor, and you will see she's a very strong regionalist writer. She's from the South, and it's pretty obvious. Naturalism is very realistic, very modern type of writing, where people are the victims of society. Again, O'Connor is a good example of that. Poe also does some of that as well. Okay, so there's some of the fiction terms to think about. And of course, the Prezi is there for you to go through in more detail. That's just some of the highlights. All right, so let's also talk about tone, style, and irony. Okay, and so this is what makes an author shine. It's what differentiates one author from another. Okay, so tone is the attitude the author is taking about the subject. It may be different than the way the characters feel. So sometimes the characters can feel excited about something, but you get the sense overall that this is actually a bad thing for them. Okay, so we see that sometimes how the character feels about what the topic and how the writer feels about the topic aren't always the same thing. Okay, and that some of that depends on how we portray the character. So in this week's reading, consider how Granny Weatherall feels about death. Her tone and the author's tone kind of feel a little different. Style is what makes a writer distinctive from all other writers. So if you've ever read Hemingway and Faulkner, you would know that they look and sound very different. Okay, so traits of style include their sentence length. Some writers use very, very short staccato sentences, whereas other writers use very long-winded sentences. So sentence length is huge. Tone, topics discussed. A Poe story anywhere, because if it's creepy and scary and a little on the odd side and somebody dies, it's probably a Poe story. So the topics that they discuss, and also the word choice. So what time period are their words from? What kind of verbs do they use? Do they use tons of adjectives? That would be Faulkner. So word choice, okay? And typically we have favorite authors because we really like their style. And once you've read one book from an author, a lot of times you could recognize any other book from that same author because their style carries over from story to story to story, okay? Just a few things about word choice, some terms I want you to know. Diction, there are two types of diction, and that's simple language versus very flowery and elevated diction. Okay, so that also influences writing style, is their diction, so their word choice. Also, the use of regional words. So if you see things like y'all, that's probably Southern. That's definitely more Texas, Southwest. So that also contributes to writer style and to word choice. Hyperbole is an exaggeration to express a point. Paradox, when something seems contradictory, but it's not. We will see that a lot in Hamlet. Hamlet loves to speak in hyperbole and paradox. So you'll see those when we get there. And then metonymy is the use of a specific name or an object to stand for something else. So we use this when we talk about like the bald eagle or the American flag or things like that. Those represent the America. Or we can talk about the White House when we're really talking about the executive branch. So we use a specific object to sort of represent a bigger idea. And the stream of consciousness is a type of writing where the writer writes the way they think. And the way we think is usually much longer, rambling sentences. And so stream of consciousness is sort of a psychological writing, which is also a particular type of word choice. Okay. So irony. There are a couple different kinds of irony, and the big idea with irony is what something appears to be and its reality are different. Okay, so there's a difference between the way things appear and the way they actually are. So verbal is when what we say is opposite of what we actually mean. Okay. So there's some examples here. A lot of times it's because we're using hyperbole, things like that, overstatement, understatement, something like that, that what we say is not actually what we mean, and the character doesn't mean it. Poe does this a lot, so be looking for that. Situational is when the situation is what is different than what common sense dictates. This is not what you would think. So an example I posted here was from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it says, water, water everywhere, all the boards to drink, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. So they're completely surrounded by water, but it's the ocean, so they can't drink it, and they're dying of dehydration in the middle of a giant body of water. So that's situational irony. Dramatic irony is when the character makes a statement that he or she believes to be true, but we as the audience know it's not true. Shakespeare does this a lot. So when Romeo finds out that Juliet is drugged and he says she's dead, but we all know that she's only been drugged and she's not actually dead. Okay, so when the audience knows something that the characters don't, that's dramatic, mostly because you see it in drama, because that's fun. All right, so last one I want to talk about is cosmic irony. And so this is an ironic twist of fate. So this is when fate intervenes and what we all believe should happen is not what happens. So it's typically cosmic irony you see because of the twist ending. Okay, O. Henry is one of the most famous writers who does cosmic irony, and we're going to read some O. Henry this week. This is different than peripeteia because that's a sudden reversal of fortune, whereas irony or cosmic irony is ironic that it happened. So then there is some disparity between what should have happened, what we all thought would happen, and what does happen at the end of the story. So typically peripeteia does not happen at the very end of the story. Usually we see it at the beginning or the middle. The ironic twist of fate is because fate intervenes. Usually peripeteia is caused because of a character's choice. So the character causes this to happen. So they are just a little bit different. All right, so that's a little bit about tone, style, and irony. Make sure you look through these, write down your definitions on your term sheet so that you have that to study from. But that is a basic overview of what we're going to be talking about in week 2. Make sure you read over the stories, and I will see you in the discussion board. Bye.